Christmas had always been my favorite time of the year. The lights, the snow, the warmth of family, it all felt magical. But last year, everything changed. Last Christmas, I learned that not all things associated with the holiday are joyous. Some are downright horrifying. It began when my family decided to buy a real Christmas tree. My parents thought it would make the holiday more special. We'd recently moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere, a quiet place where everyone seemed to know each other. There was only one Christmas tree lot in town, a family-owned business that had been around for decades. The lot wasn't fancy. It was tucked away behind an old church with rows of trees lined up under dim string lights. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. As we walked through the rows, something caught my younger brother Timmy's eye. "Look at this one," he called out, pointing to a tree in the farthest corner. The tree was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and its branches were darker than any of the others, almost black. The needles were thick, and the trunk was gnarled, twisting in unnatural ways. It didn't look like the perfect Christmas tree you'd see in a Hallmark movie. It looked wrong. The man running the lot, an older gentleman with a weathered face, noticed our interest. He hesitated before speaking. "That tree, it's been here a while. Most folks don't want it." "Why not?" my dad asked. The man shrugged, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the tree. "Some say it's cursed. Strange things happen to people who take it home." My dad laughed, dismissing the man's warning as a silly superstition. "We'll take it," he said. The tree didn't fit through the front door easily. Its twisted branches snagged on the frame, and we had to wrestle it into the living room. Once it was finally set up, we began decorating it. Timmy was in charge of the ornaments, and I strung the lights around the branches. As I worked, I noticed something strange. The tree seemed to absorb the light. Even with the string lights on, the room felt dim, as though the darkness clinging to the tree was alive. "Mum, the tree is whispering," Timmy said suddenly. We all froze. "What do you mean?" Mum asked, her voice uneasy. Timmy shrugged, pointing at the tree. "I heard it, like someone whispering really softly." "Don't be silly," Dad said, brushing it off. But later that night, I heard it too. I woke up around midnight to a faint rustling sound. At first, I thought it was the wind outside. But when I sat up, I realized the sound was coming from the living room. I tiptoed downstairs, careful not to wake anyone. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the Christmas tree. Its lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. The rustling grew louder as I approached. And then I heard it, a soft, eerie whisper. "Come closer." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but it was definitely coming from the tree. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The tree's branches swayed slightly, as though responding. The whispering stopped, replaced by a low creaking sound, like wood bending under pressure. I ran back to my room, my mind racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Over the next few days, things got worse. The lights on the tree flickered constantly, even when they were unplugged. Ornaments fell off the branches for no reason, shattering on the floor. Timmy became obsessed with the tree. He would sit in front of it for hours, staring at its dark branches. When we asked him what he was doing, he'd just shrugged and say, "Listening." One night, I caught him talking to it. "Timmy, who are you talking to?" I asked. "The tree," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "What is it saying?" He looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. "It's hungry." On Christmas Eve, everything came to a head. We were sitting in the living room, enjoying hot cocoa and watching a Christmas movie. The tree loomed in the corner, its dark branches casting unsettling shadows. Out of nowhere, the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, except for the faint glow of the tree's lights. "Did you plug it in?" Dad asked, his voice tight. "No," Mum said, her hand gripping her mug tightly. The whispering started again, louder this time. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, overlapping and echoing. The room grew cold, so cold that we could see our breath. "Turn it off," Mum shouted. But when Dad reached for the plug, the tree's branches lashed out, wrapping around his arm. He screamed as the needles dug into his skin, drawing blood. We all scrambled to our feet, panic setting in. Timmy was the only one who didn't move. He stood in front of the tree, staring up at it with a blank expression. "Timmy, get away from it," I screamed. But he didn't. Instead, he walked closer, as if in a trance. The tree's branches opened, revealing a dark hollow in its trunk. The whispering grew deafening. "Stop him," Mum yelled, but it was too late. The branches wrapped around Timmy, pulling him into the hollow. The next morning, the tree was gone. The living room was empty, as if it had never been there. There was no trace of Timmy, no broken ornaments, no blood on the floor. We called the police, but they didn't believe us. They thought Timmy had run away. A few days later, I went back to the tree lot. The man who sold us the tree was gone, and the lot was abandoned. But in the far corner, I saw it, the same dark, twisted tree, waiting for its next victim. Every Christmas, I hear whispers. In the middle of the night, when the world is quiet, they call to me. I know the tree is still out there, waiting, and I know it's hungry. Christmas is a time for joy, warmth, and family. It's a season filled with happiness, laughter, and the comforting scent of pine trees. But what if, beneath the holiday cheer, something darker is lurking, waiting to consume you? Imagine the Christmas lights, which are meant to brighten your home, turning into something sinister, something that can never be undone. This is the story of those cursed Christmas lights, and once you hear it, you'll never look at your decorations the same way again. It was December 5th, a cold winter's night, when Hannah and her younger brother Sam moved into their new home. It was a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, a peaceful area where the chill of winter gave the houses a cozy charm. The house was small but inviting, nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. There were only a few things left to unpack, and everything seemed perfect for the start of the Christmas season. Hannah was excited to start decorating for Christmas, her favorite time of the year. But as she looked around the living room, she realized something was missing. The Christmas lights. She had forgotten to pack them. "Sam," she called, "did we forget the lights?" Her brother appeared in the doorway, looking tired, as if he hadn't slept well. "Yeah, I think they're in the attic." She nodded, grateful that they had somewhere to store all their decorations. "Well, let's get them down." It's not Christmas without lights. She could tell Sam wasn't as excited as she was. His eyes seemed distant, and there was a nervous edge to his voice. "Are you sure you want to use those lights?" Sam asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Hannah frowned, unsure what he meant. "What do you mean? It's Christmas. Of course, I want to use them." Sam didn't respond, but he walked over to the attic ladder and began to climb up. A few minutes later, he came down, holding an old, dusty box with the words "Christmas lights" written on the side in faded letters. The box seemed heavy, and it was clear that it had been stored away for years. When Hannah took the box from him, she noticed how old and worn the lights looked. They were tangled in knots, the bulbs covered in dust, but there was something about them, something almost unsettling. "Sam, what's wrong with these lights?" she asked, feeling a chill run down her spine. The box almost seemed to pulse in her hands. "I don't know," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "They've always been off." Hannah rolled her eyes, trying to dismiss his fears. "You're just being paranoid. They're just lights, Sam. Nothing to worry about." Despite her reassurances, Sam stayed silent as she plugged the lights into the living room socket. They flickered briefly before illuminating in a soft, warm glow. But Hannah couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in her chest. She shook it off, thinking it was just the excitement of Christmas. As the evening wore on, she decorated the tree, placing ornaments, tinsel, and the lights carefully around the branches. Everything seemed perfect until they all sat down to have dinner. It was around midnight when the house began to feel different. The temperature dropped, and the usual warmth of the fireplace seemed to have vanished. Hannah shivered, her fingers growing numb as she tried to tidy up the living room. She glanced at the Christmas tree, and for a brief moment, the lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. She turned towards Sam, who was sitting on the couch, staring intently at the tree. "Sam," she called, her voice filled with concern. "What's wrong?" Sam didn't answer. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly agape. He looked as if he was staring into the very soul of the Christmas tree. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, this time more violently. It was as if they were struggling to stay lit. Hannah could hear a faint hum, almost like a low whisper coming from the lights. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't like this," Sam muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. I told you not to use them." Hannah was starting to feel uneasy. The house felt colder now, the air thick with a strange, suffocating energy. She moved toward the tree to unplug the lights, but as her hand reached for the plug, the room went pitch black. A wave of nausea hit her as the silence enveloped the house. Then, she heard it. A soft whisper. It was faint at first, almost like a distant hum. "Come closer." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. The voice was coming from the tree. It was faint, but unmistakable. She backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. "What was that?" she whispered to herself. But before she could react, the lights flickered back on only this time. They were brighter, far too bright, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. Then she heard it again. "Come closer." The next few hours were a blur of strange occurrences. The whispers grew louder and more insistent, as if the tree itself was speaking to her, beckoning her to get closer. The once joyful lights seemed to have taken on a life of their own. Every time Hannah tried to leave the room, the whispers intensified. Suddenly, there was a loud bang followed by an unnatural, bone-chilling cold that filled the room. The Christmas lights began to pulse like a heartbeat, and the air grew thick with the smell of something rotten. Hannah screamed, stumbling backward, and when she looked toward the tree, she saw something she couldn't explain. A figure, tall, shadowy, and twisted, standing in the darkness behind the tree, its glowing eyes locked onto hers. "Get out," it whispered, its voice rasping and chilling. Hannah's breath hitched. She knew the figure wasn't real, but the fear she felt was undeniable. She turned toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, the lights flashed one last time, and the room was consumed by darkness. When she woke up, it was morning, but the house was eerily quiet, too quiet. The Christmas tree still stood, but the lights were no longer glowing. The whispers had stopped. She glanced at Sam, but he was nowhere to be found. In his place, there was a message on the wall, written in what looked like blood. Never unplug the lights. That Christmas night marked the beginning of something horrible. The lights, those cursed lights, had taken Sam. Hannah was left alone, trapped in her own home, tormented by the whispers that still echoed in her mind. She would never forget the warning. The lights were more than just a decoration. They were a doorway, and once they were plugged in, they would never let you go. Hannah could never escape the whispers that now followed her everywhere, in every corner, in every shadow. The cursed Christmas lights had claimed another victim, and they were still waiting for the next. Would you dare to plug them in? The town of Brookhaven was a picture-perfect slice of Christmas magic. The streets were lined with twinkling fairy lights, shop windows displayed elaborate holiday scenes, and the air carried the scent of pine and freshly baked cookies. Every December, the town felt alive with warmth and joy. But it wasn't just the decorations or festivities that made Brookhaven unique. The town had a tradition as old as its cobblestone streets. A group of carolers dressed in Victorian garb who appeared each Christmas season. They sang hauntingly beautiful carols, their harmonies filling the cold air with a sense of nostalgia and wonder. Nobody knew where they came from. The carolers never stayed to chat, never accepted invitations inside. They simply appeared, performed, and vanished into the night. But this year, the carolers were different. Emily and her Mark had moved to Brookhaven just 2 months earlier. They'd heard stories about the carolers from their neighbors, who spoke of them with a mix of fondness and reverence. Emily, always drawn to small-town charm and holiday traditions, was excited to experience it herself. One crisp December evening, Emily was alone in their cozy cottage on the edge of town. Mark was working late, and she was busy decorating the Christmas tree. As she carefully placed an ornament on a branch, she heard faint singing outside. It was soft, melodic, and oddly soothing. But there was something about it that felt off. The voices were too perfect, too synchronized, and they carried an eerie undertone that sent a chill down her spine. Curious, Emily walked to the window. Peering out, she saw them. A group of 7 figures stood in a line near the edge of her front yard. They wore long Victorian-style coats and hats, and their faces were obscured by shadows. None of them moved, except for the slight rise and fall of their chests as they sang. Their song, although hauntingly beautiful, seemed to grow louder without them raising their voices. Emily felt her breath catch. She'd expected carolers to knock, smile, and perhaps share a cheerful Merry Christmas. But these figures just stood there, unmoving, singing their strange, hypnotic tune. Feeling uneasy, Emily closed the curtains and tried to shake off the chill that had settled over her. She grabbed her phone to call Mark, but hesitated. What would she even say? The singing stopped abruptly. Emily froze, her heart pounding. Cautiously, she pulled the curtain back just an inch to peek outside. The carolers were gone. The yard was empty, the streets silent. When Mark returned home later that night, Emily told him what had happened. He laughed it off, teasing her about being spooked by a group of harmless carolers. "They're probably just keeping the tradition alive," he said, shrugging. "It's a small-town thing." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next evening, Mark suggested they go into town for some last-minute Christmas shopping. Brookhaven's main street was bustling with activity, the shops glowing with holiday lights. Emily felt a little better being around people, the eerie memory of the carolers fading in the warmth of the crowd. As they walked past a small bookstore, a display of antique books caught Emily's eye. One in particular stood out, a leather-bound volume with faded gold lettering that read The Ghostly Traditions of Brookhaven. Intrigued, she bought the book and flipped through it later that night. One chapter, titled The Silent Carolers, caught her attention. The story claimed that, decades ago, a group of carolers had gone missing during a blizzard while traveling from house to house. According to legend, their spirits returned every Christmas season, drawn to the warmth and light of the living. But they weren't there to spread cheer. The book warned that if the carolers stood outside your home, you should never invite them in. Emily's stomach tightened as she read the final line. Asterisk. To welcome them is to join them. That night, Emily awoke to the sound of singing. It was faint at first, but as she sat up in bed, the melody grew louder. Her blood ran cold. She shook Mark awake, her voice trembling. "They're back." Mark groggily got out of bed and looked out the window. His face paled. "They're just standing there," he whispered. Emily joined him at the window. The carolers were back, standing in the exact same spot as before. Their song was the same, but now it seemed to carry a mournful tone, as if they were lamenting something. Mark, trying to be brave, grabbed a flashlight and headed for the door. "Don't," Emily pleaded. "Just leave them alone." But Mark was already stepping outside. As Mark approached the group, the singing stopped. The carolers turned their heads in unison to look at him, their faces still hidden in shadow. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, his voice shaking slightly. The carolers didn't respond. They stood perfectly still, their silence heavier than the cold night air. Mark turned back toward the house. As he did, he heard a whisper, soft, barely audible, but enough to make him freeze. "Join us." Mark spun around, but the carolers were gone. The next few days were uneventful, but the tension lingered. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Then, on Christmas Eve, everything came to a head. The couple was sitting by the fireplace, trying to enjoy a quiet evening, when the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, except for the faint glow of the fire, and then the singing began again. This time, it was louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from inside the house. Emily and Mark grabbed their flashlights and cautiously searched the house. They checked every room, but there was no sign of anyone. Yet the singing continued, echoing through the halls. When they returned to the living room, they stopped in their tracks. The carolers were there, standing by the fireplace. Their faces were no longer hidden. They were pale, their eyes sunken and lifeless. Their mouths moved in perfect unison, though their expressions were blank and devoid of emotion. Emily and Mark backed away slowly, but the carolers stepped forward. The whispers returned, overlapping and growing louder until they became deafening. "Join us, join us, join us." The next morning, the neighbors noticed that Emily and Mark's house was eerily quiet. When they went to check on the couple, the house was empty. All that remained was an open book on the coffee table, its pages flipped to the chapter about the silent carolers, and on the front lawn, a new group of carolers stood silently, waiting for their next audience.